just wanted to make a couple of comments on assignment 1. I wanted to get them back to you so that you have a chance to see what I am looking for and perhaps am not before you hand in assignment 2 on Thursday. And there are a couple of tips that apply to several people, and each tip applied to different people. So obviously, if you don't see this in your assignment, it's because it wasn't there, but still worth thinking about as you continue forward with the assignments. I did notice some correlation for some of you who have missed classes and things that you got confused on the assignments. So again, I encourage you, that's why we do the recording. I realize that is a commitment of time. So even if you don't get a chance to look at the recording, please come ask me. To go back to my favorite analogy, if you're not around to hear the explanation of how to hit that topspin forehand, come for pointers anyway after the fact. Come ask. You can ask me if it's a general just research question. Where on Westlaw do I find state legislative history? The reference librarians can help you as well if I'm not around, or if you want to ask them. Also, please, please, please double check that you have answered every question. It pains me no end to have to take off points because the answer isn't there. Inevitably, if you put ink on paper, I will try to give you some credit for at least trying or understanding it partially. I can't give you any credit if there's nothing near that question. So what I suggest, if you have a different way of doing, that's totally fine too. I'm not sure if you still have it, but I give you the printout of the assignment. Go just before you hand it in, or whatever point when you think you're finished, go through and check off. Okay, I got 1A sub 1, 2, 3, B, 1, 2. Good, and just check through. Because again, if you don't give me anything, I can't give you any credit. And as I said, it pains me no end not to be able to do that. That's pretty much it on the sort of general strategy for assignments. If you have any questions about what I wrote on your assignment, I know my chicken scratch is not the easiest to read. I actually do try, but as you can see, I don't really succeed. So please do come ask about that. Specifically for secondary sources, the area of assignment 1, there were a couple of areas where I noticed a few people did the same thing that wasn't quite right. By the way, when that is the case, I won't take off points, because even if I said it, I realized maybe it didn't come across as clearly as I would have hoped. And that actually is the case. A number of people, when they were looking at law reviews, they decided to limit by jurisdiction. Now, of course, that makes a lot of sense when you're looking at New York Juror for encyclopedias, but think about it. For law reviews, what if I publish an article about New York law, and I'm comparing New York law and Connecticut law, and I publish it in a Connecticut law review? If you limit your jurisdiction for law reviews, you're not going to pick that up. There are a lot of great articles about jurisdictional issues that may not be in that jurisdiction, may not be in that state's law schools or other jurisdictional specific law reviews. Lots of law reviews, including the esteemed Hofstra Law Review, publish articles about issues from all over the country, including other states. So I would say from a strategy standpoint, that's not the best strategy. Again, I had mentioned that. A couple of you did that anyway. As I said, I did not take off for that because a few people did get confused about that. Also, I have a philosophical difference with Westlaw, whether or not ALR is a treatise. I realize when you limit to text and treatise on Westlaw, Westlaw will give you ALR. Remember, ALR, American Law Reports, we looked at them in print in our very first workshop, the second class, and those are those slightly, it's kind of a cross between encyclopedia and a law review article. American Law Reports basically are those longer articles, but they're not like law review articles in that they don't tell you what the author thinks the law should be. They pretty much just tell you, like an encyclopedia does, what the law is. Gives you that wonderful table of jurisdictions. I love that. Remember, that's where we learned about preemption, and that was an issue because it was the liability of HMOs, and that's where we learned that ERISA preemption was something we had to worry about for our standing issue. So a few of you on the treatises question, especially in Westlaw, cited to ALR and actually found really good ALRs and used that throughout the question. Again, I didn't deduct for that because just because I disagree with Westlaw, it's not fair that you would expect you to know that. But just keep that in mind that ALR is going to do something different than treatises, and if you can also remember when I ask you to look at treatises, try to remember not to include ALR. Again, if you do, because Westlaw makes it so confusing, I will not hold it against you. Okay, again, if you have any specific questions about your assignment, I'll ask you to hold off until I'm happy to stay after class, or you can come find me tomorrow or whenever, and I'm happy to answer any questions, including how to decipher my chicken scratch. Okay, let's move on to state legislative history. Thanks to those of you who stuck it out last time to finish the federal legislative history workshop. For those of you who either weren't here or chose not to, we will have plenty of time Thursday after we get through the material for Thursday, which is mostly going to be just a summary of legislative history. Today we dive into state legislative history. So we are going to look primarily at New York, since I understand most of you plan to stay and practice in New York, so that'll be particularly relevant, happily, for everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit, very little, about other states' legislative history. Basically, the concepts are the same. The states have legislatures, usually bicameral, that is 2 houses. Here, of course, in New York, Assembly and Senate. Actually, I think 1 or 2 states have unicameral. Nebraska may be one, but don't quote me on the number of states. Anyway, the point being that the process is the same. A bill gets introduced, it gets sent to committee, the committees consider them, it may then go to the other body of the legislature, so Assembly to Senate or Senate to Assembly here in New York, and then ultimately to governor. 2 big differences with state legislative history from federal. First, you may be relieved to hear there are not nearly as many documents. States, it's a good news, bad news issue. There are not nearly as many documents for you to have to try to track down. However, states are incredibly inconsistent about what documents they produce, how they make them available, where to find them. So it really is a state-by-state learning necessity. So we'll learn New York, but if you need to learn in other states, what you will most likely want to do is check a state research guide. I believe I mentioned research guides in the 2nd or 3rd class. Here is New York's. Actually, this is an old edition. I keep this in my office since it's old and we don't need it in the library anymore. Again, I strongly recommend, if you can afford it, to buy your very own copy with your 2nd or 3rd paycheck after you celebrate with the 1st. And if you will find yourself in another state, see if you can find a library that has that state's legislative research guide. Maybe it's online. This one, as far as I know, is not. There are some states have different authors authoring research guides. For instance, our very own Dean Selby is authoring a very new New York research guide. It's not out yet. She's still working on it, but that may be worth checking out. Whichever version you like, that's where to go. So if I get a question about finding another state's legislative history materials, I'll either go to the research guide or, yes, I will go to that state's legislative website. So I'll type in Connecticut legislature and just follow my nose in terms of legislative materials, bills, and see what else they have. Kind of like checking the research guide first, because then I kind of know what to look for. And that's particularly relevant as we now transition to New York. Actually, before I transition to New York, here is a website, and this link is on the class websites. If you remember it, great. If you don't, that's okay too. Does everybody have a handout, by the way? You could pass these around. This is actually in the last page of the handout, just to remind you this exists. We're not really going to look at it much further, but this is a research guide of state legislative history research guides. As I said, there are plenty of good research guides online, and this is just the most comprehensive one I have found at the Moore School of Law, as you can see, and you can click on your favorite state and then learn about what that state produces, including New York. Actually, we'll take a quick look at New York. And then you can compare, and so you can see, not particularly long, a bunch of states, the end states, so it gives us links to different aspects where you might go. What's nice about these research guides and what makes it worthwhile is it will give you this New York Legislative Service, which we'll talk about very briefly at the end, is basically an organization that will compile a New York legislative history for you. You have to pay money for that, of course, lots of money, depending on your point of view of what lots is. But if you are involved in a research issue where it's just critical and you can't get the documents, you can't find them, or you're talking about a huge billion-dollar deal and it's worth the effort to pay the few $100s or whatever it is, it's good to know about. And so these research guides are good to know about because they'll point you to those sorts of organizations should they exist. Okay, now I really will dive into New York. And if you were to read any research guide for New York for legislative history, what you would learn is that there's something called a bill jacket. I think New York may be unique in that terminology. Again, don't quote me on that. So you now would know you might want to look for the New York bill jackets. And here at the New York State Library, so this is a statewide official government, New York government website. Ooh, sorry about that. And explains what the bill jacket contains. So bill passes, the governor's office collects memoranda and letters discussing the pros and cons of the bill. Sounds like legislative intent, right? And may include the sponsor's memo, and it tells you, again, so we're learning a little bit about what might be contained in a bill jacket, so what those legislative history documents might be. And then it gives you some idea of the holdings, and then there is available electronically on the digital collections page. Again, this is what the digital collections page for bill jackets looks like. The page is in the handout I sent around. The link is in the class web links. This I will be asking you to go to on your legislative history assignment when we get that. And so this way you can find the link. And what you'll see is that the bill jackets are available for laws, remember, chapter laws, our generic name for session laws, between 1995 and 2011. So if your particular issue revolved around language in a chapter law between those years, you're golden. You can come here to this New York State. It's totally free to everybody, and you can find it. So to show you how finding New York materials works, let's actually use we'll come back to this. Let's use a concrete section. So I did a search in Lexis for New York Public Health 4410, because that's the section we've talked a little bit about. And remember, Lexis, I'm here in Lexis for a reason. I'll explain why. Lexis gives us results for everywhere, so because I'm looking for a statute, I have to know to click on statutes. And typically Lexis is pretty good about putting it up top, once you remember to click on statutes. Okay, so here's 4410, and say I have decided that for our issue, the language in section 4 of 4410 is particularly relevant, and I want to get a sense of what the legislature had in mind with this language. What do I do next?
Find the chapter law.
And how do I do that?
You have to, I guess, go to the history section.
Okay, so
And look at the amendments.
you remember how to do that on Lexis?
You go to jump to.
guys are lucky we have our Lexis expert answering the question.
I think it's somewhere in the sections. I'm not sure.
So let's go to history. Okay, so somebody else give Adam a hand. He got us most of the way there. So what chapter law are we interested in if we want to research the intent for section 4 of our section? It's not a trick question.
I would read it if I could see it, but I can't because my eyes are so bad.
You're welcome to come and look closer. I could actually make it bigger. Let's see. Control. Let's see. If I make it too big, it goes off the screen. So how's that for a little bit bigger? Helena?
Chapter 705, Section 5.
Everybody see? I think, Royce, you were about to chime in. And how did you determine that Chapter 705, Section 5?
Is this subsection 4?
Subsection 4. So within the history, you want to look for your section mentioned and then see what chapter law. Now, the reason I came to Lexis as opposed to Westlaw, well, we want to look at both, but the reason I came to Lexis is Lexis puts that information in the history. With Westlaw, you have to remember to go to the editor and reviser's notes. And that's what I call the historical and statutory notes, because it's called historical and statutory in the print. Westlaw calls it editor and reviser's notes. Lexis calls it history. It's all the same, but what Lexis does is it makes it nice and easy to get to. So there's a plug for Lexis. Okay, so we now know we want, what's the other important piece of information? Chapter 705, Section 5. Within Chapter 705, we also need to know how is this organized?
About a year.
By year. So what year is it?
96.
96. So let's walk our way through. So we want to start with 96. And then we have to do my favorite, but we want Chapter 705. So there's the range with 705. And then my favorite part of guessing which one this is, I usually just go somewhere in the middle. And we want to go a little further. You might be able to search. I'm never sure exactly, especially when you're searching images, what you are searching, so my personal preference is just to guess where, but if you want to search, that's fine too. But we found 705 at long last, and here it gives you some information about the bill. And then you have to notice right up here, download PDF. And hopefully in a moment or two, we'll get to see what a bill jacket looks like. Ta-da! So again, if you're in those years, 95 to 2011, you're great. This is pretty easy once you know how to find the information. So here is what gets tucked in a bill jacket. So the bill is missing, but we can find the bill in other places. Here's a memorandum filed with the bill. Here's a committee on rules. Typically what you'll find is a sponsor's memo. We saw that referenced in that explanation of bill jackets. Whoever sponsors the bill issues a memorandum saying why they are sponsoring it, why they think it's a good idea. They wouldn't be sponsoring it, obviously, if they didn't think it was a good idea. So subject and purpose, that sounds intent-like. Summary of provisions. So this is where you might want to go. And then there might be other memoranda from other people. There might be memoranda from outside parties, especially if it's particularly controversial. Here's a governor's program bill. And actually there's quite a bit here for this particular section. So here's a Caviecia memo. Caviecia, I guess, is a legislator.
I think it meant revised.
Oh, is that what it said? Okay, so much for my reading someone else's. Yeah, you're right, it's revised. That's funny. So much for my reading other people's handwriting. Get what I guess turnabout is fair play. Okay, so different memoranda, revised or otherwise, from different, here's something from the council to the governor. So different points of view on this bill. Okay, finding so that's the first place I would go for New York legislative history, again, assuming the years are between 95 and 2011, and obviously you may not memorize that. I actually forget it, and I'm actually still hoping they'll go beyond 2011, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But whether they do or not, you just go to the website and you'll see the years, and if it's your year, great. If not, then you try something else. And the something else might be, and we'll take a look briefly at the three services. I'll start with Bloomberg, only because it's got the least. We'll work our way to what might have more. So again, on Bloomberg, I will follow my nose. I might either start with state law, or I might start with legislative and regulatory. You'll wind up in the same place however you start. But here's state legislative materials if I start here. And then I choose my state. And out of all of these, New York legislative, again, just following my nose, that makes the most sense. And New York legislature. And as you can see, not a huge amount here. Again, I always take a look at those I-links to see. So we have bills. So that bill was missing, although it's from 1996, so it wouldn't be here on Bloomberg. And these links to Assembly are to just, I think it will tell you here, to their rules, which really isn't going to tell us anything about a specific section. It's going to tell us about the rules of the Assembly. So again, Bloomberg, not very much available. Let's go back here on Lexis. Any questions, by the way, on Bloomberg? Back here on Lexis, we got started and we did well to find our history. The best way I have found, at least, to find legislative history for state materials on Lexis is to go to the section, find the chapter law, or if it's another state, whatever they call their session laws, and click on it. And here is where I will get the bill. So this would be one place to find the bill that was missing from the bill jacket. And then click on bill tracking. Bill tracking, as we talked briefly about, it will tell me with any given bill what happened to it. Now, of course, we know this bill became a law because it's cited as a chapter law. And why isn't the bill tracking getting me anywhere? It did work earlier. There we go. And it gives me the bill tracking report. And in this case, all it will do, is will tell me what happened to the bill, which, as I said, we already know. Sometimes there may be links in here. But that's pretty much it. So again, our New York State Digital Collections website, by far, has the best collection thus far. Lexis, I have found, may occasionally link to bill jackets, but I think it's for more current measures. I don't know the year range, but we would look and browse and find it if we wanted to. Okay, I'm going to move on to Westlaw. And again, Westlaw, I can pull up my section in any number of ways. I'm going to go to Statutes and Court Rules because I like the template, which is over here on the right. You can also type just New York Public Health 4410 and you get to it that way as well. If you're, probably that is the correct citation, or a citation format Westlaw recognizes. Either way. And okay, so just to give you an idea of what, remember in Westlaw, the credits will refer us to the chapter law, but we don't know which chapter law affected which section. Remember, Lexis in the history told us right up front, which is why I started there. But if you're on Westlaw, as I mentioned, what you need to remember is to go to history and that editor and reviser's notes. So that's where you'll want to start state and federal legislative history. Once you're in your section, you want to check the editor and reviser's notes, and then here we would say see subdivision 4, 1996, chapter 705, what we saw with one fewer click on Lexis, so a little bit more direct on Lexis. And then once we know that we want chapter 705 from 1996, we can go back up to the history tab to the legislative history materials and see what Westlaw presents for us. And Westlaw presents for us some of these bill jackets. So Westlaw goes back a little bit further in time on the bill jackets than does Lexis. And so we see, actually, interestingly, there are a bunch of different chapters here, so you want to look carefully. I guess other chapters in 1996 affected other parts of section 4410. We want to make sure we get the one we're interested in for subdivision 4 and go to the bill jacket. And this happens a lot with bill jackets. You can get there, although interestingly and I think significantly, Westlaw's just giving me a hard time. It would look just like it did on the state website. With our academic passwords, we have access to the bill jackets. As I said, there's just some hiccup here between Westlaw and the web. However, I hope I mentioned to you, and it's worth repeating again, as alum, you're all welcome to come back to the library anytime. We would love to see you. And anybody visiting, but physically visiting the library, has access to what we call our Westpac terminal. Our contract for academic access limits us to students, faculty, and staff. We cannot give it out to attorneys who aren't Hofstra people, as I like to call them. However, as alum, we're not allowed to give out, even though you're a Hofstra alum, so you are a Hofstra people, we're not allowed to give out Westlaw academic passwords. So you either have to work for an organization that pays for it, Westlaw, or pay for it yourself, or come and visit our Westpac terminal, which is available to anybody who is welcome to use the library. However, the Westpac coverage is different than the academic coverage, and one of those differences I discovered are the bill jackets. Whereas you will eventually be able to click on the bill jacket on your academic account, if you sit at the Westpac terminal, you would click and you would get a different error message that said this is not available under your subscription. So I don't know, wherever you wind up if you wind up in the commercial or government world, even if you have Westlaw, you may or may not have bill jackets within your subscription, which means you still want to know about that New York State Digital Collection site. Any questions on Westlaw? One other aspect of New York legislative history that you want to know about, sometimes most of the time I should say, chapter laws are enacted, signed by the governor, and they affect particular sections or maybe a group of sections of different titles of New York law. So whether it's the public health law or their general obligations, domestic relations, you name it, they'll affect. Sometimes what the New York legislature does is it appoints a committee to look broadly at a particular area. A number of times in New York's history, they've revised the CPLR. In fact, it didn't even used to be called the CPLR. I don't know what it's called in the past. But how practice and the substantive rules of practice that are contained in the CPLR. When that happens, there will typically be a legislative report. So if you are dealing with an issue that involves one of either CPLR or one of those areas of law that have been looked at more broadly, what you may see in those historical and statutory notes, editor and reviser's notes, or history, depending on what service you're looking at and what it's called. So in other words, in those historical notes, you will see a reference to a legislative report. So that's how you'll know. It won't just be subdivision 4 of chapter 705. It'll actually say legislative report. They're tricky to find if they're old. And by old, I mean like more than 5 years old. But here on the New York Assembly site, there is a link to legislative reports, and as you can see, it goes back a couple of years. They are findable, and again, when you reach that stage, ask for help. We won't be worrying about that any more than what I'm talking about now, but I did want to make you aware because since you all will be planning to be practicing in New York, and if you do find yourself needing to do New York legislative history research, just be aware that these reports exist. And actually, if these reports exist, then that's going to be the first place you must go to look for legislative history. I don't know if you recall, when we first started talking about legislative history a few classes back, I showed you a New York case where the whole case revolved around legislative intent, and I talked about that enterprising young associate who went and researched legislative history and found all this great text about it, and that's what determined the decision in the Court of Appeals. Well, that legislative history that enterprising young associate found was a New York legislative report, because it was a CPLR question, it was a statutes of limitations question. So those legislative reports, again, would be the first place to go if there is one in your in the issue that you're researching. Okay, so legislative reports would be first, bill jacket would be second. However, as we've already seen, bill jackets are kind of tough to find, even if you can get there on Westlaw. They're limited back to 95 on the New York website, limited on Lexis as we saw. They are also limited on Westlaw. I suspect 95 may be the backwards date for Westlaw as well. I haven't confirmed that, but they don't go back too far. And I have not found access to a bill jacket post 2011. I don't know if the New York Library just hasn't got around to compiling it yet and making it available online and to these other online services. I don't know what's happening. And it's been 2011 for a couple of years now. That doesn't mean that there's not legislative history documents being produced in New York, which means, as far as I can tell, you have two options. One is to go to a service, like I was mentioning, the New York Legislative Service, and pay money. The other, shock of shocks, is going to the good old-fashioned print. Believe it or not, we have print sources for legislative history post-2011 that aren't online. So here's a really sort of weird example of how print is actually more up-to-date than online. So where you would go, and that's pretty much what the handout shows you. What I did with the handout, again, these are sample pages, is I included these. We've already looked at many of this. I've included these mostly as a resource for you to go back to when you do your legislative assignment, as a reminder of where to find chapter law information and where to find the section information. So that's on pages 2 and 3. Page 4 is the New York State Library digital collection. So you can Google it since there's no link there, but the link is on the website. Page 5 is an example of bill tracking. We've talked about bill tracking already. Here's a bill tracking on the Assembly site. We're really not going to do much with that. Page 6, McKinney's session laws. Now I'm showing you 1996 because we're talking about Chapter 705 from 1996. However, McKinney's session laws are current in the library through 2013. So we actually, again, are more recent in print than we are online, ironically enough. And remember, McKinney's session laws are the red volumes that say McKinney's on the spine. McKinney's, the statutes of New York, are the black volumes that don't say McKinney's on the spine. And McKinney's session laws are designed in a way, typically they're in fact, almost universally, they're 2 volumes per year. The first volume will have the laws, the chapter laws. So if you wanted to actually look at the text of Chapter 705, you'd pull out Volume 1 for 1996 and just turn numerically to 705. Kind of straightforward, I think. Volume 2 for 1996 are the memoranda, tables, and index. So essentially, whatever McKinney's has for legislative history, which will be different than what's in the bill jacket, because in this, since this is 1996, we can look at both, but it will have something. So again, for those years where those bill jackets aren't obtainable, you'll get something at least from McKinney's. Now, this is not meant to be a trick question, so I know it may not be obvious. Does this remind anybody of another publication that we used last time, where the laws are in the earlier volumes and the legislative history is in the later volumes? Fair enough. You may remember we used UScan last time for those of you who did the legislative history workshop last time, and the earlier volumes have the public laws, the later volumes have whatever legislative history UScan is going to reprint. And surprise, surprise, they're both published by West. So West kind of got into this, hey, we're going to reproduce the chapter laws or the public laws for federal in the early volumes of a year, and then the later volumes will reproduce whatever of the legislative history we feel like, which is kind of what UScan does, and it's pretty much what McKinney session laws do. So it works the same way. Volume 1, chapter law, you can look at 705, chapter 705. Volume 2, again, organized by number, so you turn and find. So actually you can see it better on the handout. So page 7 is the actual chapter law for 705. And you can see on page 8, section 5, which tells us that section 4410 is amended by adding the new subdivision 4. So again, what we learned in the editor and reviser's notes, history, historical and statutory notes, depending on what you were looking at. So that's the actual text of chapter 705. That's in volume 1. Turn to page 9, volume 2. Again, memoranda, tables, and index. It's the memoranda that you're interested in. Turn to page 10. Again, I put that little handy-dandy arrow up top on the left just to help you find 705. You just look for it by number, but that's where you want to look if you're flipping through the book to find your chapter number. And then what we see in McKinney's on page 10 is we see the memorandum in support, New York State Senate. And it tells us, essentially, why the person writing this memorandum thinks that this is a good idea. And I'll pass around volume 2. So again, no need to use McKinney's in print if you can find it in the Westlaw, New York digital collections, or if it is on Lexis. But if it isn't, post-2011, pre-1995, then you kind of have not much choice. Well, you can go to McKinney's, or you can, there's one other source we'll talk about in a moment, or you can pay for it at the New York Legislative Service. And that one other source, you see page 11, our memorandum continues, as well as on page 12. And that other source is starting on page 13, which is called the New York State Legislative Annual. And that's actually a publication put out by the same people who does that New York Legislative Service. Not that it's important you know that, it's just a fact. And you can see that actually on page 13. And so there's 1996, and it works the same way. You find your year, you find your chapter law by number. And so as you can see on page 14, we see chapter 705. And we actually see that this is that governor's program bill. Remember when I was scrolling down the bill jacket from the New York Library website, we saw governor's program bill. So actually by checking both sources, by checking McKinney's session laws and the New York Legislative Annual, I found 2 separate documents. Now yes, again, they're all in the bill jacket online, but if that's not available, then you want to, at least for the moment, you want to use the good old-fashioned print and check both sources. We will be doing a workshop in a minute or two that's going to ask you to dive into both those sources. We'll be headed upstairs. And speaking of which, and actually you turn page 16, there's actually another document, and page 17 is that Moore School of Law website with the different state research guides that I mentioned. Any questions? Okay. So here's the workshop sheet. You'll want to bring up your laptops. We are going upstairs because I mentioned you want to look at McKinney's and the legislative annual. I'm going to ask you to work in teams. You will figure out what works best for you on that score. So there's 3 and there's 3. And again, you're welcome to bring up all your stuff because we'll be done with class once you're finished with the workshop, or you can leave it down here, which is what I'm going to do, and just come back after, although we do have to be out of the room for the next class, but that's not till 6 o'clock. I'm just going to make sure to pick up what I need here.
Throw these back in the cart, or you want me to?
Yeah, that would be great.
Sure thing.
Thank you. We'll be at the same table, so for those of you who are 2 steps ahead of me.
Which table is that?
Right by the reference desk. You should see the sign.
I'm sorry about being late, by the way. People would just like stop driving because of the snow. Thank you. But when I was like here, it was only lightly snowing, so it wasn't an issue yet, but people are still not driving.
Yeah, I'm afraid that sort of happens. Okay.
Heading home for the day.
Yeah.
Alright,
See you
see you
guys
later.